Thinking Tactically is a paid program. The information provided is not legal advice and should not be used in lieu of legal counsel. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and their guests are not necessarily those of West Coast Armory North or this station.
Every day, we hear stories of innocent people who are the victims of violent crimes. Do you want to leave your personal defense up to someone else? Or take the initiative and be responsible and prepared to defend yourself and your family? If you answered yes, this is the show for you. Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. And now, here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
Good morning and welcome to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. I'm Kevin Smith.
And this is John Holshin.
Thank you for joining us today. For our episode, we're going to be starting off with some lessons from the news. So, John, what do you got for us this week?
This story comes out of Manville, Louisiana. A man became irate, highly agitated in a convenience store, some sort of disagreement with the clerk. He became verbally abusive, including using racial slurs. The clerk ordered the man to leave the store, and he did, but he kept coming back in. Somewhere in there, another customer in the store who was a legally armed private citizen decided to insert himself into the situation as well and tell this agitated customer, a man by the name of Breland, that he should really just leave. At some point, Breland went back outside, but kind of the straw that tipped things over the edge, he came back in and threw a bag of potato chips at the clerk, and then left again, storming out of the store. Our legally armed private citizen followed him out of the store. He states in order to get his license plate number, at which time Breland became even more agitated, if you can imagine, exited the vehicle, and according to the armed citizen, began pushing and shoving him. The armed citizen retreated into the store with Breland pushing and shoving him. According to the police officers that have seen surveillance camera footage, there's pushing, shoving going on, and the armed citizen retreats into a corner where he can go no further, threatens Breland, tells him that if he doesn't break off his attack, he's going to shoot him. At some point, he does draw his weapon. I didn't mention that this weapon was being carried in an exposed holster, open carry, so Breland should have known that he had it the whole time. And at some point, the citizen evidently felt that he was in danger of losing the weapon. He fired a single shot that had no effect. Breland then appeared to be reaching for the gun, and the private citizen fired two more shots. Breland was pronounced dead at the scene. So the question here is, you know, the obvious question, people like to jump to the end of these things and say, well, gosh, you know, he's trying to take my gun away. What else was I supposed to do? You know, where I come into this is the other end of these things. When people ask me what I would have done, my answer is usually I wouldn't have been there.
Well, based on what you've said to me, it sounds like he re-engaged, or he went out and initiated this conflict after the incident where the individual threw the potato chips, which, yeah, it's annoying, yeah, it's frustrating, but it happened, it's done, nobody's hurt, nothing's damaged. That situation can end right then and there.
Well, exactly. I mean, the whole thing here, what was the clerk trying to do? He was trying to get the guy to leave. So, yes, he's now been struck evidently in the chest with a bag of potato chips. It's hardly a deadly assault. And the assailant is now in his vehicle, apparently intending to leave. You know, I understand as good people, we feel like people should be held accountable. People should have to pay a price for their rudeness. But the fact of the matter is the criminal justice system has got a lot going on. They're pretty dang busy. And really, it isn't a good use of anybody's resources to get a cop out there and try and press charges for somebody bouncing a bag of potato chips off your chest.
Well, and like I go back to the years that I was a safety officer in high school, it was all we were trying to do was solve these situations to resolve them to a peaceful end. And if the situation's ended, you don't want to re-engage and try to escalate a situation just because you feel that he should have apologized or he shouldn't have done something minor. You know, you let that clerk take that into whatever they feel like doing with regards to pressing charges, looking into it, and instead now we've got somebody who ended up losing their life over a bag of potato chips.
Exactly, and that would be my point. You know, when you carry a firearm, as far as I'm concerned, we should be prepared to behave with a higher standard of care. And there's a predictable event here. He engaged verbally, then he followed him outside to get a license plate number. Again, what are you going to do with the license plate? You really think the police are going to be interested in pressing charges over somebody bounced a bag of potato chips off of somebody's chest? That's really just not realistic thinking. The man's leaving, let him leave. Be a good witness to what happened should something else occur. But that's it. At the point where you're now at that point where you've got a gun in your hand and he's reaching for it, you're right. At that point, your options become much more limited. But there were so many things prior to this that could have been done different, right up to, we'll be talking about everyday carry here in a little bit, and I'll give you some more ideas there as well. But again, it's all intents, but as of right now, from what law enforcement says, they do not anticipate pressing charges against this citizen. He was at that moment. It would be reasonable for him to expect that this guy reaching for his gun is a potential deadly danger. But boy, I look at it from my point of view and think there are a lot of things that he could have done to keep himself from getting in that situation.
Well, and it sounds like there still could be something brought up, charges brought up against him later on, depending on what the prosecutor looks at, and he's definitely going to be looking at potential civil suit because of the mitigating circumstances that led up to the self-defense.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot is in the eyes of the prosecutor and his opinion of the law and what he thinks he can get in terms of convictions. I could see this going either way. I could see other prosecutors saying, no, a jury needs to hear this and determine whether this really was justifiable in the totality of the circumstances that led up to the shooting.
Well, and for our listeners, the key lesson out of this isn't necessarily that whether or not he should or shouldn't be charged. We're not really getting into, that's not our concern here. Our concern is to make sure that you are aware of your situation and what you're doing and your actions that are leading to the final outcome, so that you can be aware of, is this something where I need to be engaging right now? Is the situation resolved, but when that person leaves, what am I doing that's helping the situation and benefiting everyone?
Sure. I would say, look at it in the totality of circumstances. Was this the best outcome for anybody? Was this the best outcome for that legally armed citizen? Now he's having to deal with all the possibilities here, worrying about criminal charges, worrying about, depending upon what the law is in Louisiana, he may have to worry for 3 years before he knows whether he's going to be the subject of a civil suit, and dealing with the aftermath of a shooting. Is that really the best outcome? And was there really no choice but to get yourself in that position? Those are the things we need to contemplate in advance.
Thank you, John. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we're going to be joined on the phone by Dr. Wes Doss, a legend in the training community. So stay with us. You're listening to Thinking Tactically on Fox Sports 1380. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. Brought to you in part by West Coast Armory North, providing expert personalized service to each individual client. For more information, log on to westcoastarmorynorth.com. Insights Training Center is locally owned and nationally recognized and offers the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to civilians and private organizations, law enforcement, and military. In business for over 20 years, they've taught more than 20,000 private citizens, law enforcement officers, instructors, SWAT teams, corrections personnel, security officers, and military personnel, offering classes from basic self-defense and handgun safety to advanced tactic classes and everything in between. Insights Training Center has a course for you. Their professional instructors come from highly specialized and thorough backgrounds in law enforcement, military special operations, and the private sector. Visit InsightsTraining.com for a complete list of upcoming classes.
The Northwest Women's Shooting Network is a comprehensive resource in person and online for all women's shooting needs and questions. Everything from basic education to continuing education, we're here to help you find and buy the right gun for you, get the proper skills for personal protection, and to create a welcome and safe environment to learn with other women. Coming from over 30 years of combined experience in the shooting industry, we are mothers, sisters, wives, and just plain awesome gals. In other words, just like you. Our commitment is to help you become an informed, skilled, confident woman. We are based out of West Coast Armory North in in Everett, Washington, minutes north of Seattle. We offer a variety of events, seminars, training, and more. Already we have hosted a variety of events such as Kids Safety Day, Ladies Night Out, and shopping events. And we also hold regular women-only classes in addition to our Ladies Shooting Club and Ladies League. At the range, we have over 70 rental firearms for you to try before you buy, and every Thursday is Ladies Day. Find us at westcoastarmorynorth.com under the Women's Network tab and on Facebook at Northwest Women's Shooting Network.
Taking responsibility out of someone else's hands and putting it into yours. This is Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. And now, back to more of the show. Here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
All right, folks, we're joined this morning by Dr. Wes Doss. Wes is a legend in the training community and just a fountain of wisdom on so many things. I'm really excited to have him here this morning. Good morning, Wes.
Good morning.
Hey, if you don't mind just taking a minute, of course, I know about your training background and that sort of thing. Our listeners do not. Would you summarize a little bit for us, just kind of your expertise and experience that you bring to the table on the topic?
Well, don't count me in as being the definitive expert in anything. I'm just a guy who's had the opportunity to get a little bit of background. I've got 21 and a half years with the U.S. Army, both active and reserve, and I've got a 20-year retiree out of the law enforcement community here in Arizona. And been training law enforcement and military full-time, part-time since 1992.
And as I said, I've known about your training and courses you do and, highly recommended. But frankly, it took me by surprise when we spoke the other day. And you mentioned your educational background. And that explains some things, really, because you do such an awesome job in training. Could you tell us a little bit about the linkage there between your higher education and the training community?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess kind of a disclaimer on that, first off, would be I'm not a psychologist that got interested in what we do late in the game, after the fact. It's really important to recognize that I was an enlisted soldier and a street officer before I ever cracked a book in psychology or was involved in it. So my perspective on us is night and day. But I do have a doctorate in psychology, and we do apply performance-based psychology or sports psychology towards most everything that we do at Kyber.
Awesome. And as I say, it definitely explains some things to me, because you can tell when people understand how to train and how to teach versus just have knowledge, and you've got both, and that's awesome.
Appreciate that.
Hey, Wes, what I'd like to talk about today is some of the lessons learned. You're out there doing your Light Sights and Lasers program, and that is targeting predominantly law enforcement and military, of course. Our audience are predominantly private citizens interested in preparing for self-defense situations. What do you see technology-wise, training-wise? Talk to us a little bit about the crossover and what that experience dealing with those professionals can bring to the private community.
Well, there's huge crossover. And you know that as well as I do between the two communities. And from the professional side of the house, we keep statistical information on everything that we're involved in, which we generally don't on the other side of the house. So, where are the lessons going to be learned from? So it's a value for everybody to glean, that information from that perspective. What I've seen, and I think you and I go back similar paths and the similar age, so we've seen a lot of the same changes take place. There's a huge tendency to shift towards technology, and I'm seeing a lot of people have gaps when it comes to just the fundamentals and just the bare bones basics that they need to master before they try to pick up a technological device.
It doesn't matter how you're aiming it. The fact of the matter is you've still got to have a steady hold and trigger control. Well,
absolutely. Here's a good example. We'll do a patrol rifle program, and when you get our course material and the gear list and everything, it says, I don't care what optics you're running on your weapon if you run optics, but you must have either original iron sights or backup sights, because the first day to 2 days, give or take the class, is going to be strictly all iron sights. And inevitably, I'll have 3 or 4 people will show up that don't have any sights in their guns because the agency has issued flat-top weapons without sights. So we've got our optics. Well, what happens when the optics go down? Well, mine never go down. Well, what I'm finding out is that the vast majority of officers with patrol rifles that are out there just lack familiarity with that tool. They've qualified with it. They've shot on the range with it, but it's never really been deployed. and they've never experienced, the things you and I have experienced in faraway lands where sometimes gear doesn't always work the way it's supposed to, and sometimes it doesn't work at all, and you've got to be able to shift gears.
Absolutely. So that flexibility, and as you say, back to foundations on the skill set. So Wes, what I'm hearing is exactly what I teach as well, and that's that adherence to the foundational skills is just absolutely critical.
Absolutely. No, you can't get the foundation or the fundamentals are everything.
What do you see in terms of technology that may enhance once somebody has those foundational skills? Lights, obviously, you've got to be able to identify your threat. Sighting systems, red dot sights are everywhere these days, handguns and rifles. Lasers seem to be coming back out in popularity, or rising at least in awareness in the civilian community. What any particular place you would tell people they ought to focus their attention?
Well, I think the one must, no matter of all the technological devices, whether you're talking lasers or RMRs, red dots, anything along those lines, the very first and foremost would be a light. And otherwise, if you don't have a light with you or on you, then whatever you've got is relegated to being a daylight only tool. And, whether you're a civilian or you're in law enforcement, a grand portion of our day, every day, involves periods of diminished light. And that's something we just can't get past. We've got to be able to see what's in front of us.
That's, the lights are maybe not as sexy or not as much eye candy as some of the sighting systems and so on. But you've got to be able to identify the threat before you can even think about engaging. Absolutely.
And along with the lights, they're not all created equal. A lot of people will gravitate to a weapons-mounted light because, perceptually it's an easier, simpler system, but it's a different kind of tool. That it's just not a tube with a bulb and batteries with an on and off switch. There's a time and a place to use one. So there always has to be training behind the use of a tool like that. Same as with a laser.
That's a difficult one in my work dealing with private citizens. To basically where I come down is I tell them that a weapons-mounted light is not a substitute for a handheld light. It absolutely has its place and can be of great value, but it does not substitute for that handheld light.
Well, I'd agree with you 100% there. And we could go in for hours going over the virtues of handheld versus a weapons-mounted and then some of the problems associated with it. But either one, that whole concept of balancing two tools in your hands at one time becomes one of the most difficult things. People think it's easy. I have a flashlight, it's got an on and off switch. No, there's more to it than simply just that.
Wes, some of my clients are folks that are getting up in years a little bit, as I am as well. And reading glasses or difficulty with close vision becomes an issue. And seeing the front sight on your handgun becomes a bit challenging. Various strategies, of course, to deal with that. But one of the things that I run into every now and then is folks being attracted to laser sights for that reason. What's your thoughts there?
From beyond all the tactical side of laser usage, that's one of the biggest boons is that, it's not on the gun. It's not 26 inches in front of your face. It's projected directly on a target. So it does reduce that need to find a focal plane to be able to see those sights.
What drawbacks do you see or pitfalls do you see when people move toward lasers?
Well, the same one I fell into. For 7 years I worked for a major laser manufacturer here in the United States, and I was the training director. And for 7 years I shot nothing but lasers, and I was doing all these wild and crazy demos. And then when I didn't work for them any longer, suddenly I had to relearn essentially my iron sights. So there can be a dependency that you can get on it. And a lot of people will balk at that dependency, but we do a real simple exercise in class. I'll ask everybody in the class, who here has a smartphone? And 2/3 or greater of the class will raise their hand. It's like, well, how many times have you checked your smartphone while we've been sitting here in class? Okay, well, that's a dependency issue. I mean, how many of you remember phones that weren't smartphones? And how many of you remember pagers? And how many of you remember payphones? Sure. And now how many of you have smartphones? So we all become dependent on things, and sometimes we don't realize it.
Absolutely. And it's not just high technology like that. It can be even the style of firearm. I shot a very nicely tuned 1911 exclusively for a number of years, and discovered the same thing when I then went to work for an entity that issued me a double action, single action semi-automatic. I had my ability to shoot a double action gun it was just atrocious. I couldn't hit anything. And I realized that I had become dependent upon that trigger that only moved a 32nd of an inch and only took 3 pounds of pressure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great as long as you have it, but again, it brings us back to fundamentals, doesn't it?
Without a doubt. And another thing too is people will look at lasers and it's high tech, and they'll say, well, it's going to solve all my problems, and it can't, because it does have limitations when it comes to bright sunlight, whether it's green or red. Green less so than red, but the fact is that all light, it's frequency of light versus frequency of light, they all will wash out in very bright sunlight conditions. So it will have limited application in really, really bright environments.
Yeah, I've worked a bit with both colors, and in both situations have just come against backgrounds that were absorptive or of a nature that came up, and it's like, all right, where's the dot? It's gone. Let's find the sites.
Right, exactly.
Wes, one of the things we discuss is what we call the hierarchy of survival, and it starts off with what we call mental conditioning, and we just think that is just so important. You've got some real expertise in that area. Talk to me a little bit about psychology of training.
Well, there's more to training. It's a high demand training, or should be a high demand training, not necessarily high stress training, than just simply going out and going through the mechanical skills process. Drawing, presenting, shooting a piece of paper, shooting a piece of steel is one thing, but that mental side is what's going to carry you into the actual fray. It's what's going to prepare you to go into that situation and bring you back out of that situation. And when the why part of the training isn't taught as heavily as the how part of training, we're really only teaching a small segment of what needs to be taught.
Can you give us an example?
Well, just in simple mental preparation, the issue of focus and breaking down attention, getting people. We all talk about situational awareness. That's a topic that comes up in every single solitary class that's out there. Well, you got to be more situationally aware. Well, sure. Somebody explain what situational awareness actually is, because you can only be consciously aware of so much in your environment at any given point in time. You can only have your focus lie in a given area. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we really try to get people to think about is when you walk into an environment or when you're in a new environment, I don't want anybody walking around in hypervigilance. I don't want you to burn yourself out on your way to the grocery store and be so over the top paranoid that you just can't function. But I want you looking for the unexpected. I want you to focus on nothing. I want you to simply watch your environment. Absolutely. And as you start watching your environment and you become disengaged from what you expect to see, suddenly you start seeing more things, if that makes any sense.
One of the places I start folks there is I tell them it's not looking for a bad guy behind every bush, but it's knowing the bush is there.
Well, absolutely. You and I talked about this before about some of the stuff that Dan Millman had done, and one of his most famous quotes was, there is always something happening. It's just a matter of whether you are paying attention to it or not.
Sure. And that's what I really, we've read some of the same literature, of course, and, some of the law enforcement textbooks talking about awareness, and they talk about that condition yellow, as we call it, being draining, being something that wears on you and is corrosive, actually, is a term that one author used. And I tell them that, your condition yellow must be different than mine. Mine is simply that I don't care whether you're a girl watcher, a guy watcher, a bird watcher, whether you're into old cars or flowers. I don't want to miss it. At least start there. Start with, let's be engaged in the moment and what's going on around us, open to just seeing all those things that we may be interested in. And that plus knowledge will serve you in great stead when it comes to personal security issues.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And one of the simplest things that everybody is susceptible to, some people more so than others, but to a degree, every human being is susceptible to it because it's part of our hardwiring, is we have a tendency to listen to a preload of information that's given to us, whether we give it to ourselves, or somebody else gives it to us. And based on that preload, we'll start looking for what we're anticipating, and we'll start excluding what we don't expect to see. And, it's funny to watch the video. They do it on comedy shows all the time, but there was also that video that went viral many years ago that Dan Simons did, The Invisible Gorilla, where he preloads data to an audience, and that's all they see is the kids throwing the balls back and forth. They don't see the gorilla.
Sure. Yeah, if you're not familiar with that, for our listeners, if you check YouTube, Invisible Gorilla, a very interesting video clip that will expand upon a little bit of what we're talking about. So awareness is right there at the top of your list, it sounds like.
Well, absolutely. And then beyond awareness is attention, and that's paying attention to the right things at the right time, and having that you have to cultivate that ability to shift that attention from one point or one direction to another, internal, external, and that's something that the organism, the individual, has to cultivate.
Yeah, and instructors can give you some ideas and point the way, but it's up to the individual to develop that in their daily life.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you can no more make somebody stand on the range shoulder width apart and expect them to stay in that position until they realize what it feels like. Then you can tell somebody to shift your attention. They have to know what they're looking for.
So we've got awareness, attention, decision-making comes to mind for me.
Well, absolutely, and that is all based on each other. You have to be able to see something, and then you also have to be able to understand what it is you're seeing in order to formulate a plan and then execute that plan. And it's whether you're going back into the concept of the OODA loop or you're simply looking at human reaction cycles, it's all essentially the same thing. And that's what training gives us. It gives us that understanding of what it is we're looking at, provided that training has given us that information. But you've got to be able to quickly evaluate it and make that decision and make the appropriate decision.
Wes, it's great having you on this morning. I hope that the discussion that we've had here will cause people to think a little bit about their training, about what level they're training at and what level they could be training at. There's a lot of different levels out there when you look at firearms training, and this is what we're talking about here is really the cutting edge, and it's really absolutely critical topics that need to be part of any training regime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's more to it than just simply shooting a piece of paper.
Wes, before we close, is there anything that you have going on that you'd like to put a plug in for? Anything you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, no, the Light Sights Lasers Tour is not just exclusive to law enforcement and military, but it's also open to trainers that are in those communities as well. So the self-defense trainers, the firearms trainers, the tactical trainers that are all over the country that I would assume are also part of your listening audience, they're eligible for this tour as well. And I would tell them, it's a cost-free training event. It's the only one in the country. And they simply have to go to www.lslustour.com and check it out, find a location near them, get registered, and come on out.
Awesome. We appreciate the tip. Hey, we've been talking with Dr. Wes Doss. A lot of great information on training and the psychology behind training, as well as some of the technology that's out there cutting edge today. Thanks a bunch for joining us, Wes.
Appreciate having me on.
All right, still to come, we're going to recap a defensive handgun class I was able to take a couple weeks ago from John, and we're also going to talk about open carry and what that means. So stay with us. You're listening to Thinking Tactically right here on Fox Sports 1380.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. Brought to you in part by Insights Training Center, offering the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to citizens, private organizations, law enforcement, and military. Online at insightstraining.com.
Every day, there are men and women of our armed forces dealing with illness and injuries, and their families are unable to be by their side. Fisher House works to get the families of injured military members to their soldiers during these difficult times. They provide housing and transportation to help make certain our soldiers are not alone. Visit fisherhouse.org to see how you can make a difference in the lives of the brave men and women of our armed forces that have sacrificed so much for us. Those of us at Thinking Tactically and West Coast Armory North are proud to support Fisher House.
The Northwest Women's Shooting Network is a comprehensive resource in person and online for all women's shooting needs and questions. Everything from basic education to continuing education, we're here to help you find and buy the right gun for you, get the proper skills for personal protection, and to create a welcome and safe environment to learn with other women. Coming from over 30 years of combined experience in the shooting industry, we are mothers, sisters, wives, and just plain awesome gals. In other words, just like you. Our commitment is to help you become an informed, skilled, confident woman. We are based out of West Coast Armory North in Everett, Washington, minutes north of Seattle. We offer a variety of events, seminars, training, and more. Already we have hosted a variety of events such as Kids Safety Day, Ladies Night Out, and shopping events. And we also hold regular women-only classes in addition to our Ladies Shooting Club and Ladies League. At the range, we have over 70 rental firearms for you to try before you buy, and every Thursday is Ladies Day. Find us at westcoastarmorynorth.com under the Women's Network tab and on Facebook at Northwest Women's Shooting Network.
West Coast Armory North is known for its low prices and great customer service, but did you know we have training classes as well? In fact, we're introducing a new course, Handgun 101, designed with new and returning shooters in mind. Our Handgun 101 course is 3 hours long, covers handgun marksmanship, how to load, unload, and safely handle and fire a variety of handguns. All equipment is provided, and you'll leave with a free bronze membership to our range. All this for just $75. Sign up now on our website under the Classes tab at westcoastarmorynorth.com.
Welcome back to the radio show dedicated to information and education about defending yourself. Thinking tactically, personal security for today's world. Once again, here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
Welcome back. You're listening to Thinking Tactically, Personal Security for Today's World. We're now going to be talking about some training classes. I actually had the opportunity to take a general defensive handgun class from Insights Training that was ran by John. So it was a great opportunity that I had a couple weeks ago to learn a little bit more about how these training classes go. And so there's a couple of things that I learned that I thought our listeners would appreciate hearing about. The first thing that I learned that was different than what I was used to was the grip itself has changed from when I had first learned, or I guess not necessarily changed, but the style of grip that I was taught is different than what Insights is training, and it ended up where I was able to come back on target a lot easier with the new grip style. So John, do you want to explain a little bit about what I'm meaning by the grip?
Sure. Well, actually, it's grip and stance working together, and the primary focus of grip is the interface between your body and the weapon system, and that needs to be consistent. And if it's not consistent, we're going to have problems shot to shot. We've got to slow down and do a lot more aiming in between shots. What do I mean by that? Doesn't every shot need to be aimed? Well, absolutely it does. But what we try and do through that combination of grip and stance is create a neutral firing platform. The idea is what we would like to have happen. If you aim in on target in practice now, if you aim in on target, this would be a test that you've got everything optimized. Aim in on target, close your eyes, fire a single shot, let recoil happen, open your eyes and see where the gun is. If your grip and stance are optimized, the gun ideally will be back almost where it left from. We'd like it to be back exactly where it left from. Well, where did it leave from? On target, centered up on the target. So the point here is if we can create that neutral stance and grip so that after the first shot, the gun comes back nearly where you want it to be or right where you want it to be, your eyes confirm that you're back on target and you can shoot again sooner.
Yeah, no, it was definitely one of those things where I've always had a little bit of trouble with the second shot getting it back on target quicker, and it helped a lot. It ended up with a grip where my arms were a lot more extended than I had been previously, and my left hand was pointed more down with the wrist, and it once you fire up with the kick, and then it comes right back because your hand naturally wants to take you back to that spot.
Exactly, and that's, We're cautious when we look at various shooting sports and so on, what we can take from them. But there's what's generally or generically called the action shooting sports. And these folks are the fastest, most accurate shooters in existence today. It's just that simple. And that's relevant to self-defense because in some cases, a single shot may cause someone to decide to break off their attack. But if they don't decide to break off their attack, if we're talking about physiological incapacitation, the inability to continue to attack you, that usually takes more than one shot. Some studies would indicate that probably 3 or 3 point something is a good number to think about. Well, if somebody's trying to kill you or someone that you care about, when do you want them to quit? As soon as possible, right?
Yeah, you want to speed that process up.
Right. So if we know we may need to shoot multiple times in order to get them to quit, we'd like to be able to do that in the shortest amount of time. And through good grip and good stance, in effect, I'm aiming constantly with my eyes, but the grip and stance, once I get on target, the grip and stance are doing a lot of it, allows me to fire as many shots as necessary to solve the problem in a reduced amount of time.
Yeah, no, it was definitely eye-opening for that part. And then one of the other things that I learned in the class that I never really thought about much was with the draw from your holster, you don't think about it a lot, but you end up, a lot of people draw with the gun swinging up to the target. Mm-hmm. And Insights was teaching and the idea that you draw straight up and then you turn the gun to be on target so that you don't have this time period where you're swinging a loaded firearm at anywhere in front of you, other than on target.
Yeah, absolutely. And the main reason that we shape our draw that way is that, and what we're talking about here is, if you imagine, as soon as your gun clears the holster, some people start advancing the gun forward at that moment as the barrel swings up into alignment. So you're making an arc from your holster out in front of your body and up. The issue is that many self-defense situations happen at touching distance, literally at arm's reach. So now you're swinging that gun up in front of you, and if the assailant is aware that you're reaching for a gun at all, it's very natural for them to stick their arms out and interrupt that draw stroke, and you may then find that you're still pointing the gun at the ground and he's got his hands on the gun or on your arm. What we prefer to do for a draw stroke for self-defense is the gun comes out of the holster straight up as far as your anatomy will let it go. So it's coming up toward your armpit, somewhere between your hip and your armpit. And then without advancing at all, the elbow drops, the muzzle comes up so that the gun comes into alignment with the threat or with the target while your hand and the gun are still in the proximity of your body, of your rib cage. So it doesn't advance out in front at all into that possibly contested zone. We want to be able to bring the gun into alignment early. We talk about shooting from a full extended position, from a close distance shooting position, which is defined as within one step the assailant could impact the gun, or a contact distance shooting position is he's already in reach. And it just doesn't make sense to get that gun out there in front of you if he's at a close or contact position. So if we're consistent with that draw, we come up, we lock it into alignment on the threat, and then advance it upward and outward.
Yeah, that was definitely something that I hadn't really thought about when drawing, because I'm sure that that's what I was doing, was drawing with that arc up, and you end up with the gun out in front of you. You end up with the muzzle pointing at the ground and then arcing up to your target. I found that I would, a lot of times with that motion, I would come above target with that motion, just because your body, you're already bringing it up. You can't stop it as easily. Whereas when I was going through the training, when we started doing the draw the way you guys were teaching at Insights, with coming straight up and then dropping the elbow, I found it easier to get up and on target quicker because everything was already where it needed to be as I was starting.
That's a great observation, Kevin. It's absolutely. Years ago, when I first started teaching this, I had two very experienced homicide detectives in a class, and they had big city police department. They had, along the course of their career, investigated a lot of police shootings as well. So here are trained people, trained officers, and they came to me during a break and spoke to just what you're describing. And they said, they had seen a lot of shootings where the officer fired a round or two into the ground at the assailant's feet, a round or two into the assailant, and a round or two were found in the wall or ceiling behind the assailant. And that arcing motion under stress, it starts down low. You're in a panic sometimes. You shouldn't be, hopefully, but reality says you may be. And you want to get on the trigger. You may get on the trigger before you come into alignment. But that arc of motion, if you're making a strong arc as fast as you can, it's hard to stop it precisely at a single point. And it tends to overshoot the target and keep on going up. Our draw, you come up, you lock in. You can only raise your wrist so far when it's back there against your body. The wrist is bringing it into alignment, not the whole arc of your arms. Then you thrust straight out. And in that panic, thrusting straight out, well, there's a natural stopping point there at the end of your arms.
Yep.
Much more likely to be on target.
Yeah, no, it was definitely something that you don't think about, but makes a big difference on your draw and getting on target. You know, it was a great training. I got to learn a lot about my shooting stance, my shooting draw, but we also talked about the mental preparation, the classroom part of the deal and of the training. And, you know, you guys had just talked to Dr. Wes about different parts of the mental aspect. And one of the things that that you had shared in the story was a great story that I think would be great for our listeners about a very experienced firearms handler that we had a home break-in.
Absolutely, yeah. This is, I attend a lot of training conferences and industry conferences and so on as a presenter and as a consumer as well. And so I've got to know a lot of these guys that are way more talented shooters than I am, that shoot competitively all the time. And so I'm at a conference, and some of the other folks tell me about something that happened to a mutual friend of ours that is arguably one of the top, certainly top 100, probably one of the top 50 handgun shooters in the world in terms of speed and accuracy. And as the story goes, he was sound asleep one night, and his wife woke him up, said, "Hey, there's somebody in the house, wake up." And he said he kind of came half awake, and first he told her, "I think you're dreaming, go back to sleep." And she's like, no, dummy, wake up. There's somebody downstairs. Well, their household at the time consisted of he and his wife and their toddler daughter, who was asleep in the next room in a crib. So as he became more awake and heard sounds from downstairs, there were clearly one or more large people moving around and moving things downstairs. And he realized his wife was right. There was somebody in the house. At which point he leapt out of bed, grabbed a weapon, and charged down the stairs. Now, right there, we're already off track as far as we're concerned. He's not following any plan that I would have recommended, but that's what he did. As he charges downstairs, he confronts 2 or 3 young men. It appears they don't realize that the house was occupied, and they flee. So, all's well's that end well. Nothing really happened. So I said, well, okay, what's the rest of the story? And everybody kind of chuckled and said, well, you'll never guess, what he grabbed to go, repel boarders, so to speak. And well, he's known as a handgun shooter. That's his specialty. So I'm guessing it wasn't a handgun. So I said, what, a shotgun, a rifle? And they chuckled and said, no, it was a baseball bat. And I thought, okay, there's got to be more to the story. So when I ran into the individual in question a couple months later, I said, hey, I heard this story. And he said, yeah, everybody's heard the story. And I said, all right, so what was the deal, man? A baseball bat, really? To defend your wife and child, you grabbed a baseball bat. What were you thinking? And he kind of fumbled around verbally, even though he's told this story, I'm sure, dozens of times by this point. He still kind of fumbled around verbally and really said, well, that's just, it was handy. There wasn't a gun handy. And I've been a guest in their house before. It was before they had kids, and there were guns everywhere. He did not follow my plan of making sure guns are locked up either. So I said, oh, well, I'm at least it sounds like you're locking your guns up now that you've, got a daughter and a child in the house. And he goes, well, she's not really even walking yet, so I don't have them all put away. And I said, well, so where was your range bag with your practice guns in it? And he very sheepishly said, well, it was in the corner in the bedroom. I said, so you got up, you went probably past that bag of guns to get a baseball bat. What in the world were you thinking? At which point he told me that he wasn't thinking, he was reacting. And that's what we're all going to do under stress. But he was reacting without a plan. As we talked further, he shared that he had never contemplated what to do if that type of event happened. He had never thought beyond, he had never considered that possibility. So he did not have a plan. The fact of the matter is his background, he came to the shooting sports as a sport. He was a talented athlete. He had a friend that was in the shooting sports, said, hey, you ought to try this. And he sees his handguns like any other sportsman, maybe a pro golfer sees his golf clubs, or a tennis player sees his tennis rackets. Those are the tools of his trade. They're not self-defense tools in his mind, or they weren't at least that night. Since then, I and others have kind of taken him under our wing, and we've talked to him a little bit more about planning and the fact that those guns actually are potential self-defense tools. And but it just really goes to put things in perspective. Here's a guy with more skill than I will ever have. No shortage of equipment. He's got a safe full of guns, and guns all over the place, guns that he's won and guns that he has for his career. So he had the equipment, he had the skill. What did he not have? He didn't have what we call mental conditioning. He didn't have the mindset, he didn't have the tactics, and he didn't have the plan in place.
Yeah, no, I thought that gave a great example of being prepared mentally, of having that plan that we've talked about, knowing what you're doing. And obviously, the first step you should have done is make sure that everybody's safe, and then funnel point and not engage. But if you're going to go down and engage, use the tools that are best suited to protect yourself.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing that story with us. I know that your friend, we're not using the name, trying to save his dignity a little bit.
Indeed. Yeah, we all learn, and if we can learn from other people's experiences, that's the best way to do it.
All right, sounds good.
So what this story really does for us is it really brings into focus what we call those priorities of survival. And those are listed in order. They're mental conditioning, tactics, skill, and equipment. And if we look at this situation, this man has all the skill you could ever possibly want or need for a self-defense situation in terms of his weapon skills. Equipment, he's got some of the very best handguns in existence, and he's very, very familiar with them. What he's missing, however, are the two highest priority on that priorities of survival. Number one is the mental conditioning piece, and that's where your planning comes in, that's where your tactics comes in, and that was where we see he really didn't have that piece at all. That's why we structure our training the way we do and put it in perspective of the priorities of survival: mental conditioning, tactics, skill, and equipment, in that order.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll be talking about open carry and what that means. So stay with us. You're listening to Thinking Tactically right here on Fox Sports 1380.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. Brought to you in part by West Coast Armory North, providing expert personalized service to each individual client. For more information, log on to westcoastarmorynorth.com. Insights Training Center is locally owned and nationally recognized and offers the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to civilians and private organizations, law enforcement, and military. In business for over 20 years, they've taught more than 20,000 private citizens, law enforcement officers, instructors, SWAT teams, corrections personnel, security officers, and military personnel, offering classes from basic self-defense and handgun safety to advanced tactic classes and everything in between. Insights Training Center has a course for you. Their professional instructors come from highly specialized and thorough backgrounds in law enforcement, military special operations, and the private sector. Visit InsightsTraining.com for a complete list of upcoming classes.
West Coast Armory North is known for its low prices and great customer service, but did you know we have training classes as well? In fact, we're introducing a new course, Handgun 101, designed with new and returning shooters in mind. Our Handgun 101 course is 3 hours long, covers handgun marksmanship, how to load, unload, and safely handle and fire a variety of handguns. All equipment is provided, and you'll leave with a free bronze membership to our range. All this for just $75. Sign up now on our website under the Classes tab at westcoastarmorynorth.com.
The Northwest Women's Shooting Network is a comprehensive resource in person and online for all women's shooting needs and questions. Everything from basic education to continuing education, we're here to help you find and buy the right gun for you, get the proper skills for personal protection, and to create a welcome and safe environment to learn with other women. Coming from over 30 years of combined experience in the shooting industry, we are mothers, sisters, wives, and just plain awesome gals. In other words, just like you. Our commitment is to help you become an informed, skilled, confident woman. We are based out of West Coast Armory North in Everett, Washington, minutes north of Seattle. We offer a variety of events, seminars, training, and more. Already we have hosted a variety of events such as Kids Safety Day, Ladies Night Out, and shopping events. And we also hold regular women-only classes in addition to our Ladies Shooting Club and Ladies League. At the range, we have over 70 rental firearms for you to try before you buy, and every Thursday is Ladies Day. Find us at westcoastarmorynorth.com under the Women's Network tab and on Facebook at Northwest Women's Shooting Network.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. Heard every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. on Fox Sports 1380. Once again, here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
All right, welcome back. So, John, we had held off on doing our question segment until the end today because we wanted to do more of a longer answer for it. And the question that we came in is one that we get pretty regularly, which is thoughts on open carry.
Sure, absolutely. Well, that ties right in. Remember the potato chip assault story from the first thing this morning that we talked about from the news. This ties right in. That armed citizen was carrying openly. And so you may or may not be aware that open carry of a firearm is, in fact, legal in the state of Washington. What we're talking about here is having that gun in a holster on your hip. What the law says, as long as you're not carrying at a time or place or in a circumstance that manifests an intent to intimidate another or that warrants alarm for the safety of other persons, there is no restriction on you having a firearm on your person exposed. And in fact, at the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, I have their lesson plan that addresses this and the policies from a number of agencies where they make sure their officers understand this, that merely carrying a handgun in a holstered condition is not in violation of any law in the state of Washington. Our question is it the most effective thing tactically, and is it in fact the best way to represent the shooting community? When people tell me that they are considering open carry or that they like to open carry and ask me what I think, I ask them, well, you tell me why. What are your reasons for open carry? And they generally fall into one of two areas. The first is that they hope that open carrying may dissuade somebody from attacking them, from assaulting them, the fact that this bad person knows they have a gun. Well, that's true, but that leads us to something else you need to understand. When it comes to bad actors, they basically fall into two categories, or their bad actions fall into two categories, the psychologists tell us. Their actions are either what they call instrumentative, which basically means this person is a professional. This is how they earn a living, whether it's robbing people, whether it's robbing stores, whatever it is. The violence that they do is a part of, it's one of the tools they use in order to accomplish their objective. So if you have this person, he might look at you, he comes into the bank, let's say, to rob it, and he sees somebody with a gun on his hips. Well, he has two choices. He could turn around and leave, but you know what? A lot of banks have armed guards, and they still get robbed. So the presence of an armed guard doesn't tell this person, cause this person to go somewhere else. What's the likelihood that you're armed is going to cause him to go somewhere else? But it could. It may. We don't know, of course, those that came in to rob the place and turned around and left. Of course, the other possibility, if he's going to go ahead, is now you've declared yourself and your status as a potential problem to him, and he's going to have to deal with you first. The way I look at it, you may have just painted a big bullseye on yourself that says, shoot me first if you're going to do anything bad here, because I'm an armed citizen and I'm prepared to defend myself and those around me. So as far as tactics go, I believe tactically there's a lot more benefit to carrying concealed and not announcing my capabilities to the world. So I have the option to remain that quiet, perfect witness. If the situation is less than deadly force, I'm not attracting that attention. The other behavior is what the psychologists call expressive. And what we're really talking about here is a person that is temporarily or permanently off balance. Whether they're just so angry they can't see straight, we've all heard that saying, and it's a real thing, or whether they are mentally ill, whether they're off balance through some chemical that they've ingested in one way or another. We don't know at the time, and it really doesn't matter. But what we do know is that their behavior is absolutely irrational and therefore is not subject to things like, oh, he has a gun, maybe I shouldn't argue with him, maybe I shouldn't push him and pull him and shove him, like happened with the potato chip assault. As a matter of fact, maybe I shouldn't get loud and crazy and throw potato chip bags in front of this guy because he has a gun. Obviously, there's one example where none of that applied. Why? Because the person was off balance to the point that he may or may not even realize that the other individual had a gun, or he just didn't care. So tactically, again, I fall on the side of, let's keep it concealed. It gives me more options. The second reason people tell me that they open carry is to make a political statement. They may not say it that way. They say things like, because it's my right to. Okay, I understand it's your right to, but I'm asking your reasoning. If you don't believe it's tactically beneficial, then if you're carrying openly, it must be for to make a political statement. I'm interested in political statements. I'm interested in reducing the amount of negative legislation involving firearms. I'm interested in helping non-shooters understand that shooters do not represent a threat to them, that shooters are normal people. And, I have to ask you, do you really think that the best way to change somebody's mind who's anti-gun is to walk around with a gun on your hip, to go into your favorite coffee shop or your grocery store or wherever you go about in life carrying a gun? People aren't used to that. It does cause them concern. It is not, in my mind, a positive image or a help to shooters improving their image and helping non-shooters understand that we're not part of the problem. You're behaving at that point in a way that is outside the norm and attracts negative attention. So as a political statement, I don't find it helpful there either.
Yeah, it seems like you're going to be setting a situation with any people that aren't comfortable with guns. You're going to make them uncomfortable by walking in with it clearly on your hip.
Absolutely. And yes, I usually at this point in the conversation, they say, but it's my right to do so. And absolutely, it's your right to do so. I'm not arguing. It's absolutely your right to do so. I'm asking, what's your reason for doing so? And is your thinking actually consistent with your reasoning? Are your actions consistent with your reasoning?
And that's the key to it is your right to carry, open carry, when it's legal in states. And we're not saying that you can't or that you shouldn't. We're just trying to give you some perspective as to why you're doing it. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Thinking Tactically, Personal Security for Today's World. Remember, you can email us any questions you have to thinkingtactically@gmail.com, and we will try to answer them in next week's episode. And you can also stop by West Coast Armory North in South Everett, or visit them online at westcoastarmorynorth.com or their Facebook page at West Coast Armory North. Remember to join us next week right here on Fox Sports 1380 at 9 a.m. for Thinking Tactically. Until next week, stay safe. Every day, there are men and women of our armed forces dealing with illness and injuries, and their families are unable to be by their side. Fisher House works to get the families of injured military members to their soldiers during these difficult times. They provide housing and transportation to help make certain our soldiers are not alone. Visit fisherhouse.org to see how you can make a difference in the lives of the brave men and women of our armed forces that have sacrificed so much for us. Those of us at Thinking Tactically and West Coast Armory North are proud to support Fisher House.
Insights Training Center is locally owned and nationally recognized and offers the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to civilians and private organizations, law enforcement, and military. In business for over 20 years, they've taught more than 20,000 private citizens, law enforcement officers, instructors, SWAT teams, corrections personnel, security officers, and military personnel, offering classes from basic self-defense and handgun safety to advanced tactic classes and everything in between. Insights Training Center has a course for you you. Their professional instructors come from highly specialized and thorough backgrounds in law enforcement, military special operations, and the private sector. Visit InsidesTraining.com for a complete list of upcoming classes.